some of the bigger challenges that are facing the buy and sell side across CTV and really across the media landscape in general, I think you could kind of boil it into two things. So one, I would look at it as an issue that's been going on for a long time, which is how do we help planners and buyers buy across the entirety of their stack? So not necessarily just programmatic, but if you think about programmatic, both in video and in display, but then also linear TV, out of home, all of these things have really great houses to buy individually, but a single point of execution where you can go and buy across these things is still something that we haven't quite achieved, right? Sort of that panacea. And I think as sort of a sub point to that, if you think about the interoperability story and challenges that we sort of face specific to CTV, whether that's, the linear, addressable linear, VOD, or, standard streaming services, how we resolve across those things has been a challenge that we face as an industry for a long time. Each one of those channels is super important for a brand and an agency to be able to access very relevant audience. But resolving that audience can be difficult. Resolving the impact of each of those challenges can be very difficult. So, I think what we're trying to do at Beachfront is lean into the concept that a lot of those traditional challenges are not going away. And they're still just as relevant as they were, 10 years ago. So trying to bring them into the fold and make it easier to execute against them, easier to quantify who those users are, create more transparency for our brand and agency partners and our buy-side partners downstream, which ultimately creates value for the publishers.
Now, I wanted to ask you a bit about CTV publishers. There's often a perceived trade-off between achieving revenue objectives and a high-quality viewer ad experience. Have you observed that? And how can CTV publishers effectively deliver on both?
Yeah, that's absolutely, Rob. I think this is a question we face every day, right? How do we make sure that we're doing what's in the best interest of our publishers while also preserving that user experience? And I guess this might be the most obvious thing I can say, but it is the right thing to say is it's really where those two purposes converge. That's the value proposition, right? So we find that we're able to drive the best yield for our publisher partners when we are creating the best user experience. And if you think about, certain things, right? We look at things like fill rate and our ability to fill inventory, but that's all predicated on the fact that somebody stays and continues through that ad pod, right? And how do we create the best probability for that? I think a lot of it has to do with things like competitive separation or creative redundancy or creative frequency across an ad pod or across a program, right? You've probably had an experience yourself where you're watching something and you're watching a program, and by the end of the program, you've seen the same ad 10 times. Well, by the time you get to the third or fourth one of those scenarios, you might just change the channel, right? And so when we talk to our publisher partners, a lot of what we're talking to them about is, yes, we want to maximize yield, but for you by delivering creative, but I think we have to preserve a quality user experience. The right hand shakes the left.
And in trying to tackle those issues, there have been new standards for CTV advertising that were introduced recently, covering things like program level metadata and podded bidding. Can you tell us a bit more about why those are important and what role they play in CTV media buying and selling?
Absolutely. So, there's a couple of things that have kind of come out, especially recently in the RTB 2.6 spec. And that deals a lot with podded bidding, as you mentioned. But I think what's really exciting about that is, we've talked a lot about how do we make CTV behave similar to, linear TV and traditional TV. It's funny, we look at some of the way that linear TV is transacted and we think it's really antiquated, but it's always worked. It's always been consistent. And they have ways to monetize certain things within a pod that haven't been available in CTV, right? So A and Z positions, or, what are we allowed to be fluid and dynamic versus what are we calling static? So things like that create this really interesting opportunity to improve yield, but also to create more visibility downstream to the demand partners on what you're actually buying in the pod, right? When you're transacting programmatically, knowing what's A or what Z position, those bookends that have always been more valuable hasn't really been possible or has been inconsistent, I would say. So this is a real opportunity with 2.6. And then, you mentioned the metadata and the content object. As my former life, I was buying media from a performance DSP video company. And we were always looking for what signals were coming downstream to us that we could use to make better informed decisions on the user. We know that it isn't just user alone that drives highest conversion propensity. where it's adding, or where the ad is running, or what content it's around matters immensely. And so the more we can send downstream, the more informed the DSPs that buy from us can be on what they're buying and those users. And it's really, it's a synergy that kind of, it's a rising tide that floats all boats, so to speak. So, we're really excited about both of those things. Obviously, the content object continues to get adopted, and 2.6 is in its early days, but really excited about what that looks like in the future.
Well, that brings me to my final question. As far as what you see happening in the future, is there anything that's changing in media sales for CTV? Do you have any big predictions, or perhaps anything that's on your wish list for the coming year?
Yeah, I think, in terms of changes that we're seeing, from a sell side perspective, we talked a little bit about pod bidding and what that means. I think in general, that unified decisioning layer for publishers continues to get smarter. The way that they're managing what's going out programmatically versus what they're selling directly is getting more and more intelligent. It's not new, it's been around, but I think how finally we can slice things from a reporting perspective is getting better and better. And then ultimately, where it really matters, where the rubber meets the road, is how you translate what's in that insight into action, right? So things like that 2.6 pod bidding spec are really going to help us take some of the things that we see and then activate them and action them on behalf of our publishers, or help them activate them on their own stead. So really excited about that. And I think that's a great innovation that's coming down the line. In terms of wish lists, or big picture, big prediction, it might be too much of an easy thing for me to say working at Beachfront, but I do think that, that interoperable story has been something that's been so focused on, not just by us, but by everybody in the landscape for so long. And we haven't really seen a scenario where somebody goes in and executes both a traditional programmatic, I should just say programmatic buy alongside a traditional linear buy, or more traditional linear channels like VOD. I do think that this is the year. I think we're going to see people have an opportunity to go in and buy or activate against both of those supply sources, or all of those supply sources, to a larger degree than we ever have. And I think that's really exciting because, I mentioned this earlier, but every one of those impressions is just as valuable for a brand, right? It's still a person on the other end of it, and the best experience you can ask for on a television. It just, prior to you couldn't get to those people as easily, right? You had to find different ways to reach them. So one point of activation where you can just go in and get all those users in one spot is on the horizon. And, it's something that we are really passionate about at Beachfront.